Hey, what's up guys, Pablo Munoz here. Welcome to another very quick video tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to create a rather complex skin texture within ZBrush using Polypaint that you can use for any of your characters. This is a take on Edgar Allan Poe, a remake of one of my old concepts for Edgar Allan Poe, and I just want to focus on this because I use this technique that I'm going to show you on the face of this character, so it is all Polypaint. I just wanted to show you this as a reference. That's the one that I use, so if I isolate it, there we go. So let's go ahead and do it in a simpler way. So let's click on a sphere, right? And I have the skin shade 4 selected. I'm going to make it a polymesh 2D. And I'm going to go ahead and subdivide this a few times so that I have 2 million polygons. So this should be plenty of resolution to add textures, because again, this is just a primitive object without any UVs. So the texture is going to be based on the amount of polygons that we have, essentially the vertex color or the polypaint, right? So that should give us plenty of resolution. So what I will do is I'm going to paint this with a fleshy tone, let's say something like that, a bit more like that. I'm going to go to the color palette, click on fill object, and I'm going to click on OK, fill object. So now this is this color. And now I need to create a brush to allow me to create very intricate patterns, right? Or something that allows us to create complexity relatively easily. So let's do that. I already have the brush palette with me here. So I'm going to select the standard brush, or we can press the BST to select the standard brush. And I'm not going to modify this. I'm going to modify a clone of it so that I don't affect the default brush. So I'm going to click on clone from the brush palette, and you see in the clone one, we now have a standard_1 in the name. So that's going to be the brush that I'm going to use for painting. So just a couple of things that we need to do for this brush. So here at the top of the UI, I'm going to make sure that I have the ZAdd and the ZSub turned off. So I'm going to turn that off, and that way I'm not going to affect anything to do with the deformation or the volume of the sphere, but I do want to affect the color, so I'm going to enable RGB. That's about it in terms of the setup. But to make this a little bit more complex, we can click on dots and we can select the spray, and we can click on alpha, and we can click on something a bit random. This one, alpha 8, is a pretty good one, right? So it's using this as the stroke type and this as the tip of the brush, right? So now I'm going to take, let's go for more of a reddish tone, something like this. And this is something that I could use for like the cheekbones. Let's assume that this sphere is a face, right? I'm just going to go ahead and do this. One more thing that I forgot to change is the lazy mouse. So let's go to stroke, and in the lazy mouse section, I'm going to click on lazy mouse off, and that allows us to paint a little bit faster here. And I'm just pressing slightly. You see, just by changing the alpha and changing the stroke, we can generate some really nice patterns that look very real. I mean, this is only 2 colors, but you get the idea, right? This is just to variate a bit of that hue in the face. Let's say this is the chin, maybe the nose or something of a face. And let's go ahead and change these to a different color. Let's go for a more of a yellowish pale tone. Let's say that this is the forehead, maybe the bridge of the nose, maybe the chin actually, cheekbones. Anyway, so bit by bit, we can start creating a very complex texture or base texture. Just I would say this is the equivalent to blocking out the palette. And we can introduce maybe some more reddish tones, but this time, instead of using this alpha, I'm going to use something like alpha 40. Right? So I'm just going to do little spots here and there. I haven't done anything crazy complicated or like custom brush or anything like that, other than changing those settings for the standard brush to make it a painting brush, right? It's very, very simple. I'm going to go for a yellowish tone again and just do more of these dots, maybe change this alpha 40 for something slightly different. Let's go for alpha 48 and just add a bit of that. And all of these things, I mean, I'm doing this extremely fast, right? But all of these things are things that you can keep on layers. So that way, if you think maybe these dots are too much, you can just reduce the quantity. I'm not going to do it, but if you want to do it, all you have to do is go to the layers, click on new layer, and start using that layer, right? So you can click on new layer. Let's say if I do it blue for whatever reason, start doing that. And then if you don't like it, then you just reduce the opacity of that blue layer, the combination. So I'm just going to delete it. Not going to use layers, but that's all you have to do really. All right, so now we have the base. This is the equivalent of having the palette. So what I would recommend is to do a generic pass of the texture. So concentrating on the variation, the intricate details of the face, you know, like maybe some moles, some little spots, blood vessels. Another cool thing that you can do for blood vessels would be to change the stroke to drag rect and select something like alpha 22, and then you can click and drag, not with blue, with a red color, and it will generate this type of thing. So what I would do is press spacebar and reduce the intensity of the RGB quite a bit, so that again, it's all about the subtleties. So you can start dragging. Maybe that's too much. There we go. So you can start dragging these things here and there to generate those blood vessels, maybe around the nostrils, eyelids, that sort of thing. And then we can just jump back to what we had, spray and alpha 8, select a different color, more of a fleshy color, and then just go over what we did just before to integrate things. There we go. So very subtle. If you zoom in, you can see there's like some nice blood vessels there. It's pretty simple, but the point here is that try to keep it as generic as possible. So very intricate, very interesting texture, but don't go for like scars or wounds or anything like that, or more of a darker color for the eye bags or anything like that. Just go for your gut feeling of what a face should look like, and obviously use as many references as you can. In fact, if you can find albedo references, that would give you a very good starting point as a reference. And let me just show you. If you go to the render palette here, you can switch between preview and flat. So if you click on flat, you will see just the color of the texture. The preview is obviously with the shader. Now, here is the cool thing for the trick, or the next part of the tutorial, right? So this is something that I created for this particular character. So very pale, almost, I was trying to replicate a little bit of that darkness of Edgar Allan Poe. So very pale, but all of these, let's say, darker areas around the eye bags, maybe the ears, the nose, slightly more of a pinkish hue, that's all done with the next technique that I'm going to show you, which is the history recall, right? So what I want to do is, from this one, I'm going to save the current state, and then I want to call it back, okay? And you can do this in a few different ways. I'm going to show you my favorite, and I would say the most non-destructive way of doing things, but it does require to duplicate the current subtool. So if you have a subtool or a face that has 8 million polygons, you can still do it. Just keep in mind that it's going to end up being a very big file if you duplicate the same subtool, but it is pretty handy. So here is the trick. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, right? And I'm going to call this duplicate of this, let's say, face sphere. I'm going to call it base, and I'm going to take this one and I'm going to duplicate it one more time, and I'm going to call it dark skin. And I'm going to take this one, rename it, and I'm going to call it, I don't know, blue, whatever you want. This could be anything, right? And I'm going to press S to go into solo mode, or just click in here. So this is the solo mode, and I have just one of these spheres. So if you go to the Polypaint palette down here, Polypaint, we already have Polypaint, right? We already have colors, but I want to adjust the entirety of these colors. So I'm going to click on Adjust Colors. All right, and this window pop up, and we can go ahead and change the redness. So this is the the blue one, or the one that I call blue. So I'm going to take the blue intensity, push it forward, maybe add a bit of contrast as well on the red, and change the gamma slightly, add a bit of contrast. And you can also add a bit of tint if you want, with a different color, just to make things up a bit. Again, you can go crazy with these variations. I just want to show you that you could do anything you want. This is obviously a bit too strong, but it should give you an example of what I'm trying to achieve here. So basically changing that color palette, that all the intricate texture that you created with that more generic color in here. And I'm going to click on OK. And now we have this color, and can go to the subtool palette. Let's go ahead and do the same thing. And this is just going to be a slightly darker skin, nothing too like crazy in terms of like, it's not going to be a green skin or anything like that. Let's go to Polypaint. Let's click on Adjust Color, and it will keep the previous settings. So you can click on Restore or Reset, and that will reset to the previous one. So I'm just gonna actually add a bit of contrast to this and reduce the intensity of the RGB a tiny bit more. And maybe with the gamma on the green, tweak the gamma basically of the RGB channels. Right? Something like that. You can spend time here just fine-tuning it to your liking. I'm just going to add a bit of tint as well, just playing with the colors. All right, I'm going to click OK. Doesn't matter, it could be anything. Like I said, this is just an example, but now we have like two variations of things that we can use to alter the base of the skin. So now all we have to do is select the history recall brush. So I'm going to click on the brush palette and I'm going to find this history recall brush. So this is a very interesting brush that basically projects the undo history, but it can also project other subtools or even other tools, right? So you can duplicate this sphere and have it in a separate tool. It doesn't have to be the subtool, but you know, it's easier to keep everything within one tool. All right, so another thing that you need to know about this brush is that because it projects things, it cannot be used as symmetry or with symmetry. So you can go to transform palette, click on deactivate symmetry, and that way it would work a little bit better. Another thing we can do with this brush is clone it so that we don't mess with the original, but it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna do it on this one, and we can turn this brush not into a history recall brush to recover details or anything like that. We can make it work with just Polypaint. So you could have any details or any sculpted details you want, and it's not gonna affect those. So let's go ahead and turn off the C-sub. We already have the RGB enabled for this brush, and that's pretty much it. So if I go ahead and click right now on this sphere, this is what's gonna happen. We're gonna get this message saying that, well, there's nothing to recall. There's nothing, this brush cannot recall any point because we haven't assigned it. So the way that this works is that you have to hold Control, click once in a point on the timeline, right, into the history of that tool or that subtool, and then the history brush can recall that point. All right, so for example, if I select, let's use the blue skin or the blue sphere, select that, and I'm gonna hold the Control key and click on this point. So as soon as I do that, pay attention to what's gonna happen to this yellow area. So hold Control, click once. Now we have a tiny white dot or white line inside the yellow one, and that is indicating that we have stored this current state of this subtool, right? You could even go back in time and store something in another part of this undo history, and it still is going to work. All right, we have stored a current state of this subtool, and now I'm going to jump to the base, another subtool, and you'll see that this red line appears here. And that red line indicates that there's an undo history or a current state that has been saved in a different tool or a different subtool, right? So what we can do now is use this history recall brush, and we can also change the, the stroke to be spray and alpha 8, and turn it into something very similar to what we had with the standard brush. And we can go ahead and also change maybe the focal length so it's not as harsh, and we can start doing this thing. And also I'm gonna increase the RGB intensity so that you can clearly see what I'm doing, but you can bring in all the effect of that blue brush. Maybe that was too much. Just slightly bring in those hue tones. And we can just reduce the RGB intensity if it is too much. But that's basically how I generated those sort of darker areas. Because what's great about this technique is that I'm not just painting with a blue color on top of the texture that I created. I'm actually recovering the same texture with a slightly variation in hue. So all the details that we spent doing, like these blood vessels and all of that, they are retained. That is a big help when you're creating these very complex textures. Right? And the cool thing about this is that you can at some point say, you know what, this is good, let's go ahead and now add another color, right? Or let's make it a bit more complex. Let's go to the dark skin, hold the Control key, click once on that point right there, go back to the base, and now we're just referencing a different subtool. So now we can just darken this up a little bit, and that's how I created kind of like the eye bags of the Poe concept. And let's say that I'm adding way too much contrast, and maybe this is not what I wanted. I wanted something a little bit more subtle. Well, there's no problem. You can go back to what you had. So right now, and this is another thing I wanted to show you. So right now, I'm using a duplicate as the base, right? I'm basically overriding what I had, right? So you can, within the same subtool, you can go back in time before you added any changes to something like here, maybe there, and then you can hold the Control key and click there, right? So the history brush will recall a past state of the current subtool. Hopefully that's not too confusing. Let's go ahead and go back forward in time to the current state, but because now we have this white line in here, is remembering that before we added all these blue colors and these dark areas, there was like more of a fleshy tone, pinkish, and we can just basically erase or recover some of that, but I'm not gonna press too hard so that we can create a nice transition like so. But look at how much richness there is in this texture, like how much complexity. And that's kind of like what I wanted to highlight with this technique, that it doesn't have to be like a hard job of like creating all these details, and you might see something, and I don't know, this is like a sphere with a bruise maybe. It is very complex, but it doesn't have to be a complex process, right? If you know the steps, if you know the techniques, you can create something very convincing with just 3 variations of color and the same texture. And that's about it. That's the whole point. So just as a quick recap on this tutorial, all you have to do is create your base texture. That's essentially what I had originally with this color. Then you can duplicate whatever mesh you have, in this case a sphere. You can use the Polypaint Adjust Color under the Polypaint palette right here to change the entirety of the the complete set of changes that you did in your texture. You can update the hue, the saturation, the gamma, all of that, and then you can duplicate that subtool or that sphere in this case as many times as you need to, and then you can jump into the history recall brush, do a couple of changes like turning off the ZAdd, maybe changing the stroke and the alpha, and then holding Control and click on any time in the timeline of the current subtool or another subtool. It doesn't have to be that one, and basically project that. In fact, it doesn't even have to be the same subtool. As I mentioned before, you can actually have separate tools as long as they occupy the same space. So just as a quick reference of that, I'm going to go ahead and clone this entire base mesh. I'm going to click on clone. So this is now a completely different tool, right, with a single subtool. I'm going to go quickly and just adjust some colors, something like that, just so that you can see, right? I can go ahead and hold Control and click on this point. This is again a separate tool. I'm going to go back to another tool, but because they live in the same space, I can just go ahead and start projecting from that tool into this one all I need, right? And if you want to get a little bit fancier and maybe it is a technique that you're already comfortable with, you can try to explore the same process, the same idea, but this time you can explore the ZAdd, or basically adjusting or changing the volumes or the details. So for example, in this base mesh or anything similar, in fact, let's just go ahead and clone it and have another one. I'm going to go ahead and fill this with a gray color multiple times because I have the RGB in low intensity. There we go. And then I'm going to use the damp standard brush very quickly just to add some lines. This is just as a quick reference, right? Just some lines in there. Well, you can take the history recall brush, and instead of using the RGB, you can use the ZAdd. So it's not going to affect the color, but it's going to affect the any volumes that you have. So I'm going to hold Control and click on that one, right? Go back to my working file here, and I'm going to also change to a basic material so you can actually see what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to start brushing, and you see how I'm projecting with this type of stroke and with this type of alpha. I'm projecting those details from a completely different tool. You can go crazy with this type of details and generate a lot of variations just with the history recall brush. So very, very powerful technique. I use it mostly for adding complexity to textures like the skin textures or creature textures, but you can also use it to project details from one mesh to the next one. So hopefully you have found this technique useful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Cheers.